This screencast discusses the functions of the skeletal system. There are 5 functions of the skeletal system. Sometimes support and protection can be grouped together, leaving you with just 4 functions. The functions are support, protection, body movement, storage of inorganic salts, and blood cell formation. We'll now go through each one of those 5 individually in a little bit more depth. Support is that the skeletal system gives shape to the head, face, thorax, and limbs. In other words, they're the reason that we actually have a shape and a structure instead of just being a blob. And it also supports the weight of the body through the lower limbs, the pelvis, and the backbone. In terms of protection, you can see that certain bony structures protect different organs. These match up fairly well with the cavities of the body. When you look at the skull, you see the skull protects the eyes, the ears, and the brain. When you look at the eyes, you can obviously still poke yourself in the eye, but the orbit or the bony structure around your eye does do a good deal of protection of your eye. Your heart and your lungs are protected by your rib cage, including your sternum and your shoulder girdle. A girdle is just an encircling ring or a confining structure. The spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, made up of your individual vertebrae. And then the organs of the lower abdominal and pelvic cavities are protected by the pelvic girdle. When we look at body movement, we look at the skeletal system in the context of a lever. There are 3 different classes of levers that we're not going to get into in this, but we'll talk about the 4 parts of a lever. A lever is a simple machine that uses a rigid bar or a rod in order to do work. So it's going to move at the fulcrum or the pivot point in order to overcome resistance through putting in some sort of force or effort. So in the case of the body, you see here, we're going to be moving the lower arm using the biceps. In order to move our forearm, the biceps is going to supply the force. The fulcrum is going to be the elbow. So the elbow is where the movement is actually occurring. And these 2 bones, the radius and the ulna, are going to be our rigid bar. So the muscles will supply the force to pull on the rigid bar to move it at the fulcrum or the pivot point and overcome the resistance. Sometimes that resistance is just gravity. Other times we have some sort of weight that we are overcoming. Another function of the skeletal system is the storage of inorganic salts. The main salt that is stored is calcium. When we talk about the microscopic structure of bone, we'll talk more about how this calcium is stored and what it does. But within our body, calcium helps make up bone tissue. It has a crucial role in muscle contraction and in nerve cell function, and also assists in blood clotting. When we look at calcium, these are all very important functions. However, the one that's going to give first is bone. So when we think about calcium, we should think of the bone as a bank for calcium. It's where we put our extra calcium when we have too much, and it's where we get our calcium when we have too little. Without muscle contraction, nerve cell function, and blood clotting, we die. So we need calcium for those 3 first, and the bone acts as a sort of bank. Here's a feedback loop that includes the regulation of blood calcium. So you can see the calcium over here, or the feedback loop of calcium is over here. What I did is I split those 2 in half so that you can see what happens when it gets too high and when it gets too low. There are, of course, lots of details involved, but for right now, what we'll focus on is that when the blood calcium level is too high, so you have extra calcium in your blood, the receptors detect that, and the end response is that that calcium is going to go into the bones. When the blood calcium level is too low, the receptors detect that as well, and the end result is that the bone is going to be broken down in order to release calcium. So again, you can think of the bone as a bank for calcium in this regulation of calcium feedback loop. When we have extra calcium in our blood, we put it in the bones. When our body needs more calcium and our blood calcium levels are low, we take it from the bones. Once we learn about the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, we'll talk more about this in the context of bone remodeling. There are also other salts that are stored, but again, we focus on calcium in the form of calcium phosphate. Additionally, you can store harmful elements in the bone, which get stored in there after accidental exposure. The final function is blood cell formation. This is called hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis begins in the yolk sac in utero, later in the liver and spleen, and then finally, blood cells are formed in the bone marrow. So what is marrow? Marrow is a soft mass that is found in the spaces between our bone tissue. We have two types, which are yellow and red. If we look at red bone marrow functions in the formation of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So it produces hemocytoblasts, which then differentiate into the different types of blood cells. Red bone marrow is red because of hemoglobin, which is a pigment that carries oxygen in our blood. Red bone marrow is found in the cavities of most bones of infants. And then in the adult, it's only found in the axial skeleton here, as well as some of the proximal ends of your long bones. So you can see here, the infant skull is entirely red. The red marrow is all over the body. And then in the adult, you can see it's still in the axial skeleton, so it's in the skull, the ribs and sternum, the vertebrae, and then you have it in the pelvis and the proximal ends of your long bones, your humerus and your femur. Yellow bone marrow replaces red marrow as you age. Yellow marrow stores fat and has a little bit of a role in white blood cell production. In adults, yellow marrow can revert to red marrow when needed, for example, in the case of disease. So you can see here, an infant is all red marrow, then yellow marrow begins to form, then more yellow marrow until an adult, you just have a little bit of red marrow left in the end. So those are the functions of the skeletal system: support, protection, movement, the storage of inorganic salts, and blood cell formation, also called hematopoiesis.